One of the first things people notice when a female empath has been deeply hurt is not what she says, it's what she stops saying. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. In the beginning, the empath often believes that understanding creates connection. She believes that if she can just explain herself clearly enough, communicate her intentions honestly enough, or express her feelings deeply enough, the misunderstanding will disappear. She assumes that truth, once spoken, will naturally be recognized. So she talks. She explains. She clarifies. She tries again. Then she tries one more time. What many people fail to understand is that this behavior isn't driven by weakness. It's driven by hope. The empath genuinely believes that human beings can meet each other through understanding. She believes that if she remains patient and compassionate, eventually, the other person will see what she sees. But repeated emotional injuries create a profound psychological shift. There comes a moment when she begins to recognize a painful reality. Not everyone misunderstands because they lack information. Some misunderstand because they have already chosen a narrative. Some are not searching for clarity. They are searching for confirmation of what they already believe. And no amount of explaining can reach someone who is committed to misunderstanding you. This realization changes everything. The female empath starts noticing how much energy she has spent managing other people's perceptions. She begins to see how often she has sacrificed her own peace in exchange for temporary acceptance. She remembers the endless conversations, the carefully crafted messages, the late-night attempts to repair conflicts that she didn't create alone. And gradually, something unexpected happens. She stops. Not because she has nothing to say, not because she no longer cares, but because she finally understands that self-respect requires boundaries, even in communication. Psychologically, this is one of the most significant transformations an empath can experience. For years, her identity may have been partially built around being understood. When that need becomes excessive, it creates a hidden dependency. Her emotional state becomes tied to whether others validate her intentions. The moment she breaks that dependency, she recovers a tremendous amount of personal power. This is why her silence can be so shocking. The people around her were accustomed to her efforts. They expected explanations. They expected emotional labor. They expected her to continue carrying the weight of every misunderstanding. When she suddenly stops volunteering for that role, it creates confusion. Some mistake her silence for anger. Others mistake it for indifference. But neither interpretation is accurate. What they're witnessing is acceptance. Not acceptance of poor treatment, acceptance of reality. She has accepted that she cannot control another person's perception of her. She cannot force honesty into someone committed to distortion. She cannot make herself visible to someone determined not to see her. And once she accepts that reality, she becomes remarkably calm. Philosophically, this reflects a timeless principle. Human suffering often emerges from attempting to control what cannot be controlled. We suffer when we demand that others understand us exactly as we understand ourselves. We suffer when we attach our worth to external approval. We suffer when we confuse explanation with influence. The hurt female empath eventually learns a lesson that many people spend a lifetime avoiding. Your character exists independently of someone's opinion of it. That lesson is liberating. She no longer feels compelled to attend every misunderstanding. She no longer rushes to defend herself against every accusation. She no longer treats every false narrative as an emergency requiring immediate correction. Instead, she allows her actions to speak over time. And that is where true confidence begins. Because confidence is not the ability to convince everyone. Confidence is the willingness to remain grounded when some people refuse to be convinced. The irony is that when she stops explaining herself, people often pay more attention than they did before. Her silence creates a mirror. It forces others to confront their own assumptions without her constantly guiding the conversation. And for some, that silence becomes impossible to ignore. What shocks everyone isn't that she becomes louder. It's that she no longer needs to be. She discovers that peace begins the moment you stop auditioning for understanding and start living according to your truth. And the people who genuinely value you will recognize that truth without requiring endless explanations. Remember this: the strongest voice in the room is often the one that no longer needs to defend itself. After she stops explaining herself, something even more surprising begins to happen. The energy that was once flowing outward starts flowing inward. This is the stage that catches most people completely off guard. For a long time, the female empath has been psychologically conditioned to focus on everyone else. She notices emotional shifts before anyone speaks. She senses discomfort before others acknowledge it. She anticipates needs, absorbs tension, and often becomes the unofficial emotional caretaker in relationships, friendships, families, and even workplaces. Because she is highly attuned to the emotional environment around her, she develops a habit of investing tremendous amounts of energy into understanding and supporting others. At first, this feels noble. It feels meaningful. It gives her a sense of purpose. But there is a hidden cost. When a person becomes excessively focused on the emotional needs of others, they can slowly lose contact with their own. Their attention becomes externalized. They become experts at reading everyone except themselves. And over time, they begin to mistake self-sacrifice for love. The hurt female empath eventually reaches a moment where she sees this pattern with startling clarity. She begins asking questions she may have avoided for years. Why have I spent so much time fixing problems that weren't mine? Why have I given endless understanding to people who offered very little in return? Why do I know so much about everyone else's struggles while neglecting my own growth? These questions are uncomfortable because they expose a difficult truth. Many empaths have invested so heavily in other people that they have unintentionally abandoned themselves. And this realization becomes the turning point. The pain that once felt like destruction begins transforming into direction. Instead of obsessing over who disappointed her, she starts focusing on who she is becoming. Instead of replaying conversations, she starts building a future. Instead of monitoring someone else's emotional state, she begins paying attention to her own. This shift is profound, because attention is one of the most valuable psychological resources a human being possesses. Whatever receives attention grows. Whatever is neglected weakens. For years, her attention may have been feeding relationships, conflicts, and emotional dynamics that drained her. Now she starts investing that same energy into herself. She reads, she learns, she heals, she develops skills, she improves her physical health, she strengthens her boundaries, she reconnects with passions she abandoned while trying to keep everyone else comfortable. And here's what surprises people. She doesn't announce this transformation. She simply begins living it. The individuals who once relied on her constant availability often feel the difference immediately. They notice she isn't responding with the same urgency. She isn't solving the same problems. She isn't volunteering the same emotional labor. To them, it can feel like she has changed overnight. But the truth is far more interesting. She hasn't become someone new. She has returned to someone she neglected. Psychologically, this represents a movement from external validation toward internal alignment. Her sense of worth is no longer determined by how useful she is to others. It begins emerging from something much more stable, self-respect. And self-respect changes behavior. A person with self-respect no longer sees exhaustion as proof of love. A person with self-respect no longer believes their value comes from being endlessly available. A person with self-respect understands that generosity without boundaries eventually becomes self-destruction. This is why the female empath's healing journey often looks selfish to people who benefited from her lack of boundaries. But there is an important distinction between selfishness and self-preservation. Selfishness takes from others without concern. Self-preservation protects your own well-being without apology. The hurt empath finally learns that caring for herself is not a betrayal of others. It is a responsibility to herself. Philosophically, this reflects a principle that appears throughout human history. You cannot sustainably give what you do not possess. You cannot offer peace while living in chaos. You cannot provide strength while operating from depletion. The more whole you become, the more authentic your contributions become. Ironically, when she stops trying to save everyone, She becomes stronger than ever before. Her confidence grows naturally, because it is rooted in competence rather than approval. Her happiness becomes more stable, because it no longer depends on someone else's behavior. Her presence becomes more powerful, because she is no longer seeking permission to exist. And this is where many people experience the greatest shock. They expected her pain to break her. They expected her disappointment to weaken her. Instead, the wound became a doorway. The energy she once poured into chasing understanding, fixing relationships, and carrying emotional burdens is now fueling her own evolution. And that evolution changes everything. Because the moment an empath stops investing all of her energy into everyone else and starts investing it into herself, she doesn't become less compassionate, she becomes unstoppable. Remember this. The greatest transformation begins when you stop asking where your energy went and start deciding where it deserves to go. As she continues redirecting her energy back toward herself, another transformation begins to emerge, one that is often misunderstood by the people around her. She becomes far more difficult to manipulate. This doesn't happen because she becomes cold. It doesn't happen because she loses her compassion. In fact, her empathy often remains exactly where it was. The difference is that her empathy is no longer operating without discernment. For much of her life, the female empath may have believed that understanding someone's pain automatically justified their behavior. If someone was distant, she searched for the wound behind the distance. If someone was inconsistent, she looked for the fear beneath the inconsistency. If someone hurt her, she often focused on understanding why, rather than evaluating whether the behavior should continue to have access to her life. At first glance, this seems compassionate, but psychologically, it creates a dangerous blind spot. When understanding becomes more important than accountability, boundaries begin to disappear. The empath becomes so focused on explaining behavior that she stops evaluating its consequences. She develops an extraordinary ability to see potential in people while overlooking patterns. She sees who someone could become and ignores who they repeatedly show themselves to be. This is where many emotionally intelligent people get trapped, not because they lack awareness, but because they possess awareness without discernment. The hurt female empath eventually reaches a point where experience teaches her something that knowledge alone never could. Understanding a person's behavior does not obligate you to tolerate it. That lesson changes everything. Suddenly, she begins seeing interactions differently. She notices when apologies are followed by the same actions. She notices when promises consistently replace effort. She notices when guilt is used as a tool rather than an expression of genuine remorse. She notices when someone's words and behavior exist in two completely different realities. And perhaps most importantly, she stops making excuses on behalf of people who should be taking responsibility for themselves. This shift often appears subtle from the outside, but internally it is revolutionary. For years, she may have reacted emotionally to every situation, not because she was irrational, but because she cared deeply. Her desire to create harmony caused her to engage, explain, rescue, and repair. Now something different happens. She observes. She pauses. She evaluates. Instead of immediately responding to what someone says, she begins paying attention to what they consistently do. And that distinction is critical, because words are often designed to influence perception. Behavior reveals reality. A person can promise commitment. A person can promise change. A person can promise honesty. But behavior is where intentions become visible. The female empath who has been deeply hurt begins trusting patterns more than promises. She realizes that consistency is one of the purest forms of truth available in human relationships. This is where many people become confused by her transformation. The same woman who once gave endless chances suddenly starts saying no. The same woman who once tolerated mixed signals begins walking away. The same woman who once carried the emotional burden of every relationship starts expecting others to carry their share. And she does all of this without unnecessary conflict. That is what makes it so powerful. True emotional maturity does not always announce itself with confrontation. Often it reveals itself through selective participation. She simply stops investing energy into dynamics that require her to abandon herself. Philosophically, this represents a movement from emotional reaction to conscious judgment. Many people confuse empathy with agreement. They confuse compassion with compliance. They confuse kindness with self-sacrifice. But wisdom eventually teaches a different lesson. You can understand someone's struggles and still refuse their behavior. You can care about someone deeply and still establish distance. You can recognize a person's wounds without volunteering to become one of them. This is the balance the hurt female empath finally discovers. Her empathy remains intact, but it is now guided by self-respect. Her compassion remains intact, but it is no longer blind. Her kindness remains intact, but it is no longer available at the expense of her own well-being. And once this happens, manipulation begins losing its power. Why? Because manipulation depends on predictable emotional reactions. It depends on guilt creating compliance. It depends on confusion creating dependence. It depends on fear creating hesitation. But when a person learns to observe rather than react, those mechanisms begin to fail. The empath who once felt trapped by emotional games now sees them clearly, not because she has become cynical, but because she has become aware. And awareness is extraordinarily difficult to control. The most surprising thing is that this transformation doesn't make her harder. It makes her stronger. It allows her to engage with people from a position of clarity rather than obligation. She no longer confuses being needed with being valued. She no longer mistakes intensity for connection. She no longer interprets sacrifice as proof of love. Instead, she chooses relationships where respect and reciprocity exist alongside compassion. And that is the moment her life begins to change. Because the day you stop explaining away patterns and start paying attention to them is the day you reclaim your power. The clearest sign of growth is not that you see the truth, it is that you finally act on it. And this brings us to the final transformation, the one that shocks people more than anything else. By this point, the hurt female empath has stopped explaining herself. She has redirected her energy back toward her own growth. She has learned to recognize manipulation and protect her peace. But the most unexpected change is still ahead. She quietly evolves beyond the people who hurt her. Most people assume that pain creates obsession. They expect betrayal to produce revenge. They expect rejection to create bitterness. They expect a wounded person to spend years trying to prove something to those who underestimated them. And for a while, that temptation exists. After all, there is a part of human nature that wants validation. There is a part of us that wants those who dismissed us to finally understand what they lost. There is a part of us that imagines a future where the people who caused our pain suddenly regret everything. But the female empath who truly heals begins to realize something profound. The desire to prove your worth to someone who failed to appreciate it is still a form of karma. Attachment. It may feel different from love. It may feel different from longing. But psychologically, it keeps your attention tied to the very thing you are trying to escape. And attention, as we've discussed throughout this conversation, is one of the most valuable resources you possess. The moment she understands this, another shift begins. She stops asking how to make them regret losing her. She starts asking how to become the fullest version of herself. That subtle difference changes the trajectory of her entire life. Because now, she is no longer building her future as a reaction to the past. She is building it as an expression of who she truly is. This is where genuine transformation separates itself from temporary recovery. Temporary recovery is focused on feeling better. Transformation is focused on becoming better. The hurt empath begins investing her energy into growth that has nothing to do with the people who wounded her. She develops new skills. She pursues opportunities she once postponed. She strengthens her mind. She deepens her self-awareness. She creates a life that reflects her values rather than her fears. And she does this quietly. That is the part many people fail to anticipate. There is no dramatic announcement, no grand performance, no campaign for recognition. She simply becomes, day after day, choice after choice, habit after habit. The person she is becoming gradually outgrows the environment that once confined her. Psychologically, this reflects one of the most powerful principles of human development. Growth often occurs when identity expands beyond old narratives. For years, she may have viewed herself through the lens of the relationship, friendship, or circumstance that caused her pain. The hurt became part of her story. The betrayal became part of her identity. But eventually, she realizes something liberating. What happened to her is not who she is. The experience may have shaped her. It may have taught her. It may have challenged her. But it does not define her. And when that realization takes hold, she begins writing a new chapter. Not one based on proving people wrong. One based on proving herself right. She begins trusting her own instincts, trusting her own vision, trusting her own ability to create a meaningful future. Philosophically, this is the difference between living in reaction and living in creation. Reaction keeps your life connected to the behavior of others. Creation places responsibility back into your own hands. One makes you a passenger, the other makes you an author, and the female empath who has truly healed chooses authorship. Ironically, this is often the moment when people finally notice her value. The people who took her presence for granted begin recognizing the space she once filled. The people who underestimated her resilience begin witnessing her strength. The people who assumed she would remain emotionally available forever suddenly realize she has moved forward. Not with anger, not with resentment, but with clarity. And clarity is difficult to compete with, because a person who knows their worth no longer negotiates for it. A person who respects themselves no longer chases what repeatedly rejects them. A person who has learned from their pain no longer needs revenge to feel powerful. Their growth becomes the answer. Their peace becomes the answer. Their life becomes the answer. In the end, the greatest shock is not that the hurt female empath survives the experience. It is that she transforms it into wisdom. What was meant to break her becomes the very thing that awakens her. And that is the lesson worth remembering. Your deepest wound can become your greatest teacher, but only when you stop living for what happened to you and start building for what is still possible.